This is the second part of the MiniMod Keyz user guide, taking a look at each of the individual modules that's contained in the system, what it is that they do and how they function. Starting with the glide and noise module. This is a multifunction module in that it supplies 3 variations of noise which can be used for both audio or modulation purposes. And coupled with a glide function, it also provides a really clean and convenient solution for controlling 3 VCOs simultaneously with just one CV connection. It does this by sending incoming voltages at the CV input down through the bus board or bus cable to other compatible modules which will receive that CV signal. I've got this cord running with the VCA open and all 3 VCOs tuned to different pitches. And if I switch on the glide and increase it a little bit, and some more, and it's maximum. Got the onboard arpeggiator running in random mode at the moment. I'll add a little bit of glide between the notes. And with this switch, I can choose to only glide up where there is an increase in CV value, or only down. There's also a hold input where a high gate signal can be used to disengage the module, which will cancel the glide and any CV changes that are coming in through the input. The 3 noise sources are quite distinct in character. White noise contains much higher frequencies and is really good as a noise source to be used alongside oscillators. This output level is quite low because the frequencies are mostly higher, whereas pink noise is darker, it contains more lower frequencies, which makes it a bit louder. And probably be more useful for sound effects and percussive patches. Red noise contains much lower frequencies, so the volume is particularly low and it's not as audible as the other 2. So really increase the input level on the filter, you can just about hear it. Because this contains much lower frequencies or much slower frequencies, this is actually more useful as a modulation source. So if I go back to the white noise, and then take red noise to the frequency CV of the filter, the VCOs have 4 waveforms: triangle wave, sawtooth, and shark tooth wave, which is somewhere between the triangle and the sawtooth. And lastly, the square or pulse wave. This has a manual control for pulse width modulation. And also the pulse width can be controlled by CV. The VCOs have both exponential and linear CV inputs for frequency modulation, and both of which have their own attenuators. This provides two different options of CV response based on the signal that you're using for modulation. For example, an incoming exponential signal might be better paired with a linear response. That would be the normal relationship between an envelope generator and a VCA. By running the same signal through both inputs, like I am here, which is a linear output from an LFO, it's very clear to hear that the level of influence added when I raise the attenuator is significantly greater with the exponential response than it is on the linear pot, which is much more subtle. The VCOs have two forms of sync. With a switch in the up position, this is like soft sync, so I'm going to take this output from the sawtooth of this leading oscillator and use that waveform to reset the waveform in this VCO. So you can hear that sounds pretty significantly different already. And to make this sound even more interesting, I can modulate the frequency of this slaved VCO. So I'm using the shark tooth output, but it's actually creating like a pulse width modulation kind of effect. There's also a sync level control to determine how closely the slave VCO attempts to track the leading VCO. Using hard sync will cause the waveform of the slave VCO to be reset much more harshly by the master VCO. That was with both VCOs tracking the keyboard, but with just the slave VCO tracking the keyboard and the master VCO free running. The slave VCO's frequency will still be controlled by the keyboard, but it will still attempt to track the master VCO, which means that its core frequency will still remain pretty much the same. Then as you play the keyboard and the slave VCO is torn between the incoming CV from the keyboard and trying to track the static VCO, each note will produce unique harmonics. This will also produce some very interesting results. The Ring SM module is a very powerful addition to the system. There is a full user guide video to this module, so this will only skim over the features, but there'll be a link in the description below to that video, which is worth checking out if you're interested in the module. As well as being a 5-channel mixer based on the famous Moog CP-3, it also has 2 sub-bass generators and a 3-input ring modulator. These will be the inputs for VCOs or whatever signals, and control the levels of the signals that are added to the ring modulation. Additionally, like the original CP3, it will add some warm distortion when signal levels are driven really high. So I'll start by patching the output into the audio input of the ladder filter, and then I'll take 3 VCOs. I'll take the square from this lowest VCO and connect that to input 1, and then 2 sawtooths. And these have all been tuned to different pitches to produce a chord. If I want to fatten that up even further, I can take a triangle wave from the first VCO, add it to the X input, and this would be the oscillator that the Ring SM uses to generate the sub basses. So if I had a -1 first, -2. And I'll take out the sound of these oscillators so you can hear just the subs on their own. That's with the original oscillator that's generating the subs from. And I'll take that out as well. And that's just the -1 and -2 sub. That's the -1 on its own. That's the -2 on its own. And these are shaped sine waves as opposed to the normal square waves that are used in the sub bass generators of the most vintage synthesizers. And they've just got a much thicker, richer, more solid tone. And maintain their pitch integrity a lot better. Additionally, if I decide that I don't need the extra input down here, and I'll take 1 to the input 5 and raise it there. 5, as you can see, it's got much hotter signal level, so I've got the pot much lower than these two, or these two rather. But now with the double switch down, actually add an upper octave to the pitch of the VCO that's being used to generate the sub basses as well. So remove the other two oscillators. So this is the original VCO number 5. Sub -1. And it gives a +1 above the pitch of the incoming VCO. We've got the same pitches as before going into the 3 inputs of the ring modulator, and this is the signal coming from the first VCO, which is feeding the X input. And these are just triangle waves, so it sounds pretty much as you'd expect a triangle wave to sound. But this is a result of it being ring modulated by the second VCO. So you can hear that change in harmonics and timbre. And then this is the second VCO, the signal coming into the second VCO being ring modulated by the third. Producing extra harmonics and making for a really complex, interesting timbre. Ring modulators are really good for making bell-like sounds and really clangorous effects. And particularly this one, it's completely analog, unlike many of the later, more common digital ring modulators. And it's actually based on a ring modulator from the EMS Synthi and VCS3. And you can also, because you're feeding a signal into the X input, you can also add the sub basses. The MiniMod voice is based on the original version of the Moog Minimoog synthesizer, including the transistor ladder filter. Unusually, this has a 3-channel mixer built in, so 3 inputs for audio signals and 3 attenuators for each. When signals are pushed beyond a certain point, they'll start to distort, so you can get that Minimoog distortion by driving the signal levels particularly hard. So just with these 3 VCOs plugged in. You get that lovely, warm, powerful and famous, much loved transistor ladder filter behaviour. And just like the original ladder filter, when resonance or emphasis is raised, it starts to remove the bottom end from the sound a little bit. That comes back in when the emphasis is quite low. And it will also self-oscillate. So if I turn off all the incoming audio, You'll still hear it. So if I start to drive these signals really high, with modular level signals significantly over 50%, we'll start to add a bit of distortion. Resulting in some hard clipping distortion. Frequency and emphasis or resonance can be controlled by CV and even 1 volt per octave, so that when the filter is self-oscillating it can be played from the keyboard. We'll take the CV out to 1 volt per octave input. And the frequency CV input is most useful for controlling the frequency of the filter from an LFO or an envelope. It also has the 1/3 of the CV value and 2/3 CV value inputs to mimic the switches on the original Minimoog, where you could switch the influence of the keyboard over the frequency of the filter down to fractions of 1/3 or 2/3. There's also a user guide video for the low-fat, which is a high-pass filter. But just to give a brief idea of how it functions, I've got the audio going into the low pass filter at the moment, and what the low pass filter does is removes high frequencies from the sound. So fully open, all of the frequencies have been allowed to pass through the filter, and as you decrease the frequency it removes the highs until there's less and less signal left. Whereas in the case of the high pass filter, the opposite is true. With the control, frequency control all the way anti-clockwise, it allows all the frequencies to come through. But as you raise it, it will start to remove the lows. The Discrete Cascaded VCA is quite a flexible unit, and it has 2 audio inputs with its own attenuators, so different signals can be mixed, and 2 CV inputs. So that means you could easily add, say, an envelope on CV1, but then mix in some LFO modulation on CV2, so you have a combination of both. Master sets the overall output level, and the offset controls how much audio is passed through the module, irrespective of the amount of CV control coming in through CV1 and 2. So you can use this just to keep the sound droning constantly. And like the ladder filter, when pushed beyond a certain point, this will also start to distort the signal. And then the master control will control the overall output, so you can compensate by that extra volume gained by driving the input level by reducing the master. So you can hear that really starting to distort now. The master volume can also be controlled by a CV. So that's the VCA functioning normally. I can use the velocity of the controller at the master input to add a bit more expressiveness to the sound. Like the VCOs, the ladder filter and the VCA, the contour generators is based on the envelopes from the Minimoog synthesizer and also shares its characteristic behaviour. It consists of two simple envelopes which feature attack, decay and sustain. With a single gate signal going into gate 1, this will trigger both envelopes. So this will give you the equivalent of a Minimoog. And I'll take the first output of the first envelope to control the frequency of the filter, and then I'll use the second envelope to control the level of the VCA. So with the switches in the up position, first of all you'll have the attack portion of the envelope. The sustain or level of sustain will be dictated by the sustain knob obviously, but the decay determines the time that it takes for the envelope to reach the level set by the sustain. So it's quite quick at the moment. If I make these decays longer, both the filter and the VCA decay level, so it's really sustain on the VCA is full, but it's made quieter or seemingly quieter by the sustain envelope being quite low, and that's the envelope that's controlling the filter, so it's making the filter darker or closing the filter. And now with the longer decay time, it will take longer to get to the level set by the sustain control. When the key's released, the sound stops immediately. With the switch in the down position, the pot controls both decay and release. So two stages of what you'd normally find in an ADSR envelope will be controlled by this single pot. And when I release the key, you get that long tapering off of the sound, both the level of the VCA and the frequency of the filter. And of course there's attack, so if I set a very fast VCA attack and quite a slow attack on the filter envelope, and if I want the filter to stay fully open, I can raise the sustain all the way up. Of course the envelopes don't have to just be used to control filter frequency or VCA level. You can use them for other things like controlling a level of modulation. So at the moment I've got the tap tempo LFO sending a triangle to the exponential CV input of this VCO. So I'll get constant pitch modulation. But if I wanted that modulation to fade in gradually, then I can use one of the envelopes to control the level of the LFO, because the LFO's got its own built-in VCA connected to level, and have the level pot all the way up, which just allows for the maximum amount of CV modulation over level. So I could use this as an attenuator for the level of modulation, but I've also got the pot for the amount of modulation on the VCO itself. And I've got the attack on this second envelope set really slow, so that should delay the level of LFO modulation over the frequency of the VCO. So now you can hear it comes in really late, starts off with no modulation and it just fades in. But the two envelopes can be triggered independently. So to demonstrate this, I've got the LFO producing random voltages using the stepped random mode. So when that random CV signal goes above a certain level, it will trigger this second envelope, which is connected to the frequency of the filter. So every so often it will randomly trigger this envelope and therefore open the filter. And lastly, there's also a full user guide to the tap tempo voltage controlled LFO. So it's definitely worth checking that out to see the huge amount of features that this module's got. It goes way beyond an average LFO module, and it can be used for the most obvious purposes, such as just a single triangle LFO with something like a filter. But it also has a large range of other waveforms. As well as random voltages, both stepped and sloped. It also has a wave twist function, which allows you to actually twist the waveform. Just turning a triangle into a sawtooth or a ramp. And of course, with the more unusual wave shapes, it creates even more interesting results. Because it can be clocked by an external signal, I can use a gate signal from this keyboard. So while I've got the arpeggiator running, I'll send that to the clock in. Now it changes the frequency of the filter with each new note, and with a multiplier I can divide that clock by half. So that will play 2 notes before it changes, or multiply it by 1.5, or 2, 3, 3, up to 4.